Hello everyone, welcome to IMPRINT IAS. I'm Varun Kula, and we're looking at the 11th chapter, The Years of Hope and Achievement, 1951 to 64, right? From the book India After Independence by Bipin Chandra, Mridula Mukherjee, and Attam Mukherjee. And this book is basically from 1947 to 2000. So this is on post-independence. Okay, so let's start. Right. Okay, so let's start. So the chapter is the years of hope and achievement, and right, if you think about the years from 1951 to 64, they were maturity and achievement, and they were years which were marked by high hopes. There were high, great aspirations. There was optimism. There was a lot of confidence, and Jawaharlal Nehru. If read about what he had to say in those years, he said that I shall not rest content until unless every man, woman, child in the country has a fair deal and has a minimum standard of living. And he said that 5 or 6 years is too short a time for judging a nation. Wait for another 10 years, and you will see that our plans will change the entire picture of the country so completely that the world will be amazed. And in 1955, again, he was very optimistic. He says there are a multitude of problems, difficulties surround us, often appear to be overwhelming, and but there is hope, air of hope in this country, a faith in a future, a certain reliance on the basic principles that have guided us thus far. There is a breath of dawn, the feeling of beginning of a new era in the long and checkered history of India. So, right. So, if you think about it, despite the fact India, was having challenges, people were very, very optimistic. People were experienced, right, towards the basic objectives of democracy, civil rights, secularism. They wanted to have a scientific and international outlook, economic and development and planning, with socialism at the end of the goal. Right. Though there was discontent among the intelligentsia regarding the slow pace of development, right, and they were also worried about the problems of poverty and employment, right. So, and also one of the big problems is going to be the discussion on land reforms, right. But among the several areas of progress and achievement, though marked by certain weaknesses and limitations, we had the consolidation of the nation and the solution of the language problem and the tribal problems. Then we had the initiation process of the independent and planned economic development. Then the evolution of an independent and innovative foreign policy. We'll talk about that in the next chapter. The initiation of the electoral process. We're going to talk about this itself right now. And the rooting of democracy. That's another thing we're going to talk about. The setting in place of an administrative system, the development of science and technology, and the beginning of a welfare state. So, right, the last five aspects are going to be discussed in this, right. So the first is the rooting of the electoral process, right, and first of all came the entrenchment of democracy, and it is an achievement which has endured, so it is now actually taken for granted, right. The process began with the framing of the Constitution after 1947, its promulgation after 26 January 1950. And the most interesting thing happened was that it was actually called the greatest gamble in the history of the world. Uh, what happened was we had an election on the basis of universal adult franchise. And, if you think about it, everyone who was above 21 years of age and older, having the right to vote, were able to vote. And there were over 173 million voters, most of them poor, illiterate, rural, and having no experience of elections. The big question at the time was how would the people respond to it, right? And interestingly, what happened, the skeptical people didn't appreciate the fact how, people would actually, come out and actually start voting and would think it as a day of celebration. A lot of people, said that democratic elections were not suited to a caste-ridden, multi-religious, illiterate, backward society like India's, and only a benevolent dictatorship would be effective, politically in such a situation. And obviously, people called elections as a leap in faith in the dark, and other talked about it as an act of faith. It was fantastic, and so on. So interestingly, what happened was India's electoral system was developed according to directives of the Constitution, right? And the Constitution obviously created an elections commission headed by a chief election commissioner. Door-to-door surveys were done, right? 70% of the voters being illiterate, right? The candidates, were to be identified by symbols assigned to each major political party and independent candidates. Right. So basically, if you think about it, it was a very, very big task. Right. Over 2,24,000 polling booths were there. You know, nearly, if you think about it, 62 crore ballot papers were printed. Uh, so if you think about it, it was amazing, right, that such a thing happened in India in 1950s. And in all, if you think about it, candidates of over 14 national and 63 regional or political parties and a large number of independents contested 489 seats to the Lok Sabha and 3,280 seats for the state assembly. So it was simultaneous elections. And if you think about it, simultaneous elections did happen in India in 1967. And out of this, 98 seats were for the former, and 669 was from, basically scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, respectively. So if you think about it, they even implemented, the reservation based on caste here. So it was amazing. The most interesting thing was the fact there were suitable, conditions were created for the free participation of the opposition parties in the elections. In this included the Jansangh and the CPI. This was despite the fact that Jansangh was communal and was a force behind the RSS, and it had, just been banned 3 years earlier for spreading the communal hatred, which had led to the assassination of Gandhiji. On the other hand, CPI had adopted insurrection policy till a few months before the elections, and even at the time was firmly opposed to constitutional structure. So, if you think about it, the communal and the left-wing parties were there, but they could not come together to form electoral alliances or even arrive at adjustments among themselves. The most interesting thing that happened was the general elections, had vigorous election campaigning by Jawaharlal Nehru. He showed remarkable energy. He covered nearly 40,000 kilometers, addressing 35 million people, or a tenth of India's population during his election tour. And Nehru's, biographer S. Gopal, actually pointed out, if you think about it, before 1947, all speeches of Nehru were about the process of adult education, of teaching the masses that they had minds with, which they could use. And if you think about it, Nehru was at the center stage of the election campaign. So obviously, Nehru, was the most important person in the elections, and also was the most, condemned person in the elections, right? And Nehru, to recognize his centrality, he said, "It's true that without me, Congress could not have a stable government in any state or center, and a process of disruption would have set in." But what he did was very interesting. He made communalism the central issue of his campaign, and the basic struggle, he said, was between secular and communal forces. And he says the main danger to India came from communalism, and it would break up India. And he says, let us be clear about it without a shadow of doubt. We stand till death for a secular state. One of the big credits which should be given for the elections, because it was conducted in a free, fair, and impartial manner with little violence, is Sukumar Sen, who was the first CEC, right? And he was invited to other nations like in Africa and Asia, right, as an expert advisor on elections. Election process was completed in May 1950 when Rajendra Prasad was elected as President of the Republic and S. Radhakrishnan as his Vice President. The people's response to the new political order, as we already talked about, was tremendous. They participated in the polls fully aware that their vote was a prized possession. It had, at many places, treated polling as a festival. It treated as a public celebration. Women donned, silver jewelry to go to the polling station. It was as if they were going to a marriage. So what happened? Just to have an idea. The Congress basically won 364 seats, and it won 2,248 seats. So it has an overwhelming majority with 45% of votes. The Communists came second, then the Socialists, then the Kisan Praja Party, right? The Jansangh got only 3, Hindu Mahasamah got 4, and so on. So if you think about it, the Congress has, overall majority here. Independents won 41 seats, so that is very interesting at that time. So if you think about it, the independents polled for more than any political party. They're 15.8%. So again, if you think about it, this why I'm talking about this. There was a question which came in, right, our exam, that is UPSC prelims. So there's a question that came in UPSC prelims, and it talked about the fact, consider the following statement. This statement one, right? In the first Lok Sabha, the single largest party in the opposition was Swatantra Party, right? And if you look here, there's Swatantra Party is nowhere to be seen, right? So it tells you that was a wrong statement. So, that's why you think about prelims now, it's not as if that they're not going to ask you questions on post independence. Okay, then let's look at a very interesting thing which is happening. The major features of this election, which characterized subsequent elections till 1962 and even later, were that number one, the Congress swept the polls, bagging nearly 75% of the seats in Lok Sabha and 68.5% of those in the state legislature. So this was there, and in some ways, a lot of people thought that the Congress was too strong for anybody else. Both the parties of the left and the communal right, performed poorly. But that's nothing. The Communist Party actually performed better, right? And along its allies, was the second largest group in the Lok Sabha. So that's there. Then princes and landlords still wielded a great deal of influence. Their party, the Ganatantra Parishad, won 22.1% in assembly seats in Odisha, 31 seats. Similarly, three communal parties won 64 of their 85 assembly seats in former princely states. Independents and small regional parties, as I've talked about, got a large number of votes and seats in the Lok Sabha and the state assembly, right? So, but after 1962, this started to decline, right? Because I think most of them joined some one party or the other. Then let's look at the next area, that is establishment of democratic institutions. So, building on the tradition of the national movement, the Indian leaders and above all Nehru further strengthened the foundation of democracy in the country by the manner of their political functioning. They gave due importance to the institutional aspects of the democratic system so that the attachment of people to democracy and their institutions grew. They adhered to the spirit as well as the law and procedures and the institutions. Nehru himself, always allowed civil liberties, right, to and press having free play, even when it criticized the government severely. The independence of the court was carefully nurtured, even when they turned down important piece of legislative, legislation such as the agrarian reforms, land reforms, etc. Right? Nehru treated the parliament with respect and made every effort to sustain its dignity, prestige, and power, even though its party, enjoyed an overwhelming majority. The opposition too played its part by respecting the parliament and procedures, functioning without fear in its portal, keeping the standard of parliamentary debates at a very high level. Parliamentary committees like the Estimates Committee started to play important roles such as treaty watchdogs over the administration. And even if you think about it, C.D. Deshmukh remarked in his autobiography that Nehru, as the head of the cabinet, was gentle and considerate and democratic, and he never forced a decision on his colleagues. And decisions was taken by a consensus and never, as far as I can remember, by a vote. So it tells you that what Nehru did during that time was actually unique. In the ultimate analysis, the manner of thinking, the manner of behavior to a neighbor and to adversary and to your opponent defines democracy, and that is what Nehru actually did during his time. Then, during the Nehru years, federalism was established as a firm feature of Indian polity, with a genuine devolution of power to the states. And Nehru always respected the state's autonomy and never imposed a decision on the state government or interfere with the policies, despite the fact that there were a lot of cases in which he should have done so. Thinking about the fact that land reforms, he didn't even force those on the state. Right, so that he would advise, he would urge, but would never step out of constitutional boundaries, which he could have in some ways. Right. Then the tradition of supremacy of the civil government over the armed forces was fully established during years. The Indian armed forces had been traditionally non-political and accepted civil control and leadership. Nehru, in particular, was worried about the possibility of armed forces intervening in politics and the government in cases of exceptional circumstances, as happened in 19th century. In Germany and in France and now in many third world countries. So he kept the size of the armed forces relatively small, refusing to permit their expansion even after large-scale military aid to Pakistan. And the expenditure on defense forces was also kept low. Less than 2% of the national income was done. And it also abandoned the British colonial practice of recruiting men on criteria martial classes. The army was given a heterogeneous character with almost every region section of society being represented in them. And thus, India was protected from the danger of militarism in its formative years. Then, one of the most interesting things was the administrative structure, if you think about it. Remember, Nehru never liked the administrative structure of India. The kingpin of the structure of the Indian civil services, and Nehru and Patel actually had a huge debate on this. Nehru was a staunch critique of the ICS and the bureaucracy as a whole, not only because of the colonial ancestry, but also because of the basic conservatism. Basically, he thought that this bureaucracy is against democratic ethos and development itself. In 1946, he had described the existing structure as a ship of the state, and old and battered, slow-moving, and unsuited to the age of swift change. Patel, on the other hand, felt that the retention of the existing administrative machinery was necessary in the then troubled times. And when it seemed that the internal stability was in danger and chaos was imminent, right? So basically, ICS was extremely important. Patel said, I have worked with them during this difficult period, right, when during the integration of India. Removed him, and I see nothing but a picture of chaos all over the country. During the last 2 or 3 years, most of the members of the services had not behaved patriotically and with loyalty, the union would have collapsed. Nehru accepted Patel's position, though grudgingly. He also realized that there was no alternative to reliance on the existing All India services if a breakdown of administration was to be avoided. So if you think about it, a lot of people wanted this administration apparatus to be smashed or dismantled, and it is perhaps quite easy to do so in the beginning of a new state. And many thought that that should have been done, and even some people even still think so. But still, if you think about it, at that time, Nehru was aware of the fact that the bureaucracy that it was, though it was not able to understand the problems of the people and the task of the people, it would be very difficult to find the new pattern, right? A new type of person. Putting a new type of person is needed, but how does he do it? So it was one of the case that it was very difficult, right? What to do? He tried various things. He, tried to look at the community development program, etc. But he realized that, it was dominated by the traditional high bureaucrats and so on. So basically, he finally realized that despite the inefficiency and the corruption, it is going to be, losing battle in some ways, right? And it will be difficult to get a large, honest bureaucracy, right? Development of science and technology. A major achievement of Nehru's era was the field of scientific research and technological education. In 1938 itself, in the message to the Indian Science Congress, it was said that science alone could solve the problems of hunger and poverty, of insanity and illiteracy, of superstition, of decadence, of customs and traditions, of vast resources running to waste, of a rich country inhabited by starving men. Basically, it meant is that India can only progress if science and technology can, typically get better, right? It is not so. Nehru basically himself became the chairman of the CSIR. The first Indian laboratory, National Physical Laboratory, was laid down on 4th January 1947. Think about it. It was just before independence. So it tells you something. Nehru, patterned the 5 IITs. The first IIT was patterned after MIT. The subsequent were Madras, Bombay, Kanpur, etc., Delhi, right? And expenditure increased in the next 15 years from 1 crore to 85 crores itself. The number of technical personnel, quadrupled. The engineering college seats went 6 times. The agriculture seats went more than 6 times. So over the years, initially it was going well, but scientific research began to suffer from bureaucratization. And because the management structure and organization, was hierarchical. It was breeding factionalism, intrigue, right? And that has become a major factor of brain drain in itself in the late 50s. Think about Hargobind Khurana, who's a Nobel Prize winner, found the DNA, right? The structure of the DNA along with others, right? And he had to leave India because he could not get a job in Punjab University in Chandigarh. Think about the fact that Manmohan Singh never could get a job. Think about the corruption that exists in all our academic institutions. In August 1948, the government of India set up a atomic energy commission with Homi J. Bhabha, and the atomic energy became a separate department with the Homi Bhabha as the secretary. The first Indian, nuclear reactor in Bombay, right, was made critical in August 1956, and that actually told that India's nuclear program was, obviously far, far ahead of others. Though India was committed to the peaceful use of nuclear power, its capacity could have been easily used to produce a nuclear bomb very quickly, and maybe it should have done actually. But at that time, India was actually dedicated to the concept of non-alignment. Further, we established Indian National Committee for Space Research in Skopar in 1962, and established a rocket launching facility in Tumba. And basically, this became the ISRO in some time. Right. So this was about science and technology. So let's look at social change. Now, most interesting thing about social change is the fact the DPSP talk about it, and the state, basically was, thinking about the fact that it had to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively a social order which, in which justice, economic, political shall inform all its institutions of national life. And there was a concept of socialist pattern of society, and it was accepted at its Avadi session by the Congress, and was an objective of the second and third 5-year plan. So there was progressive and steep income tax, excise policies. There was expansion of education, health, and other social services, and so on. The Constitution had already incorporated a provision abolishing untouchability. The Parliament basically supplemented it by having an untouchability law in 1951, and it made the practice of untouchability, punishable and cognizable. But the problem became that despite all these steps, SCs and STs continued to be backward, and oppression was still widely prevalent, especially in rural areas. And it's still the case, actually, where the scheduled caste and scheduled tribe obviously form a large part of the landless labor. And here, therefore, we needed land reforms, and somehow, in the name of federalism, Nehru didn't do so, right? And maybe it was, something that he should have done. Then women organization groups were demanding laws, regarding rights of women, and Nehru, basically supported them fully. And Charles Fourier himself said, and this quote you can use in your essays regarding women. He says, one could judge the degree of civilization of a country by social and political position of its women. And a major step in this direction was taken when the Hindu Code Bill was moved in Parliament. The bill faced obviously sharp opposition from conservative sectors of society, especially the Jan Sangh and others Hindu communal organizations, even though actively supported by the vocal members of the Congress and women MPs and other. Nehru decided that let's postpone it, and in time what they did was basically divided it into 4 different acts, and it introduced monogamy, rights of divorce to men and women, raised the age of consent, and gave property, in the women the right to maintenance and inherit property. But on the other hand was the fact that a uniform civil code covering all religions was not enacted, and especially the Muslims, and it actually not just the Muslims, the Christians as well. But Nehru was not willing to alarm the Muslim minority, which he believed was otherwise in pressure. He said the changes in Muslim personal law he would enact a uniform civil code, but only when the Muslims were ready for it. And remember, they will never be ready for it. Social reform can only be done through two ways. Either a great saint comes and does it, right, and he has to suffer himself for that, or the government does it, and the society accepts in due course. There will be a cultural lag, but that is how it is going to be. Then let's look at education. Right, the founding fathers obviously were well aware that education is most important. Remember, in 1951, only 16% of the population, right, was educated or literate, right, and the percentage was only 6% in the case of rural families. So, how do we remedy this? So, basically, the Constitution has directed that 1961, right, should be the date through which the state should provide free and compulsory education to every child up to 14. Later, this target was shifted to 1966, but this is something obviously was a huge problem. Nehru had argued with the state governments not to reduce expenditure on primary education, whatever be the nature of financial stringency, and he suggested that even expenditure on industrial development be reduced. And he says in 1961 in the National Development Council that I have come to feel that it is education that is the basis of all. And on no account, unless actually our heads are cut off and we cannot function, shall we allow education to suffer. But typically when he died, after that it was hardly followed. And remember, we had wars, etc. After that, again that problem came up. Okay. Think about the fact that from 1951, 16%, and 1951, 1991, we were 92% Indian illiterates. Now we have actually increased to more than 70% in cases. But the problem is that the definition of literacy is still the same as it was before. So that is a huge problem. Finally, Nehru did realize that there was unsatisfactory progress in education. He says, right education open to all is perhaps the basic remedy for most of our ills. In spite of my strong desire for the growth of this in our industry, I am convinced it is better to do without some industrial growth than to have adequate education at its basis. But still, his vision, I think it's still lacking in India. Right. The next thing that he did was the community development program, and he developed, the Panchayati Raj and the community development program. And the foundation was basically to have development blocks. There were 55 development blocks consisting of 100 villages, which had a population of 60 to 70,000. And, there were Gram Sevaks or the block development officers who would implement that, right? And this would basically improvement in, communication, education, healthcare, etc. There was emphasis on the reliance of the people, particularly on responsibility. And what Nehru thought was the basic objective was to unleash the forces from below, right? And the program actually achieves results in extension works, better seeds, fertilizers, and so on was done, right? Many healthcare, extension of educational healthcare services, construction of roads, tanks, schools, primary healthcare centers were done. But in time, what happened was that they themselves became replicas of traditional subdivisional officers, and the village level workers became administrative underlings. What happened was the entire program to get the peasants out of the rut itself fall into the rut, and that's what Nehru said about the program. What he did was he appointed a committee known as the Balwant Rai Committee, and it strongly criticized the CMD. And in time, it basically talked about a Panchayati Raj system. And the new Panchayati Raj system basically created a three-tier system, and basically it had a directly elected village or Gram Panchayat. Then it had indirectly elected block level Panchayat Samitis and district level Zilla Parishad. So basically, Nehru thought that cooperative institutions and Panchayati Raj could develop a radical change in society. And he said that he would transfer the responsibility for development and for rural administration to the people, and this would accelerate rural development. But remember, again, this actually suffered because panchayats were also politicized. The rural, administration, obviously was still controlled by the bureaucracy, and the state governments showed little enthusiasm for it. And there was still there's no devolution of powers, right? If you think about Panchayati Raj even today, there's a problem of fund functions and functionaries. So again, despite all the good efforts of Balwant Rai Committee and Jawaharlal Nehru, still it could not be democratic decentralization as a whole was stunted, and the role that was envisaged was hardly done. And if you think about the community development program and the new agriculture out inputs and exchange services, these were basically garnered by the rich peasants, and they were known as the bullock capitalists of that era, right? Okay, let's stop here, and this is about this chapter. That is chapter number 11. Right, we'll continue with the next chapter, that is foreign policy in Nehru era soon. Right, coming in the next video. Right, thank you so much for listening. Right, if you have any questions, do comment to us. Right, write to us at imprinknowledgesolution@gmail.com. Right, or you can join our Telegram group as well. Thank you so much.